Not long ago, the idea of the United States threatening a NATO ally would have sounded unthinkable, almost absurd. Today, it's a question asked out loud in Congress when Pentagon officials refuse to rule out military plans for Greenland, a territory controlled by Denmark, a NATO ally. We are no longer dealing with rhetoric. We are dealing with power testing its own limits. For years, Republicans have survived Donald Trump by assuming his most extreme ideas would dissolve on contact with reality. That ambiguity became a shield, a way to avoid confrontation, a way to avoid responsibility. But Greenland doesn't fade so easily, because once the White House keeps all options on the table, silence becomes permission, and hesitation becomes policy. I want you to stay with me here, not because this is about a remote island in the Arctic, but because moments like this reveal how democracies drift not through chaos, but through calculated denial. To understand how Republicans reached this crossroads, we have to examine the habit that brought them here. For Republicans, the dilemma over Greenland is not really about geography. It's about definition. Is this party still anchored to alliances, institutions, and restraint? Or has it become a vessel shaped by whatever force happens to be at the helm? For years, GOP leaders have tried to separate Trump's words from his actions. They treated his provocations as signals to manage, not positions to confront. That approach worked when consequences were abstract. Tweets faded, headlines moved on, but Greenland collapses that distance. Here, the implications are concrete. A NATO ally, a standing U.S. military presence, explicit refusal by the White House to rule out force. This is no longer an interpretive exercise. It is a governing choice waiting to be made. And that's why this moment matters, because Republicans are being asked, perhaps forced to decide whether ambiguity is still enough or whether silence, this time, carries a cost they cannot undo. To see how the party arrived at this moment of reckoning, we need to step back into the patterns that normalized it. To understand how this became possible, you have to look beyond this moment and into history. Not just Trump's history, America's. For decades, U.S. power rested on a simple bargain. Washington led, allies aligned. And force, while always present, was restrained by institutions, norms, and mutual trust. NATO was not just a military alliance, it was a political promise that borders in the West were no longer up for negotiation. But over time, something shifted. The post-Cold War order produced unrivaled American power, and with it, impatience. Expansion of influence became easier than maintenance of consensus. Security turned into leverage. And gradually, the language of partnership gave way to the language of transactions. Trump did not invent this impulse. He accelerated it. By framing alliances as bad deals and security as something to be extracted, not shared, he tapped into a deeper fatigue inside American politics. Greenland emerges from that logic not as a joke, but as a symbol of a system that forgot why its rules existed in the first place. And once that memory fades, boundaries start to look negotiable again. That's the context Republicans are operating in now, whether they admit it or not. And next, that context collides with reality. The collision came quietly and then all at once. It happened in a congressional hearing, not on a battlefield. A moment most Americans never saw. A question that should have been routine. Was the Pentagon really planning for the possibility of taking Greenland by force? The Republican asking it expected reassurance. What he got instead was ambiguity, carefully chosen words, no denial, just contingency. And that was the spark, because in Washington, what officials refuse to deny often matters more than what they confirm. When the Defense Secretary says the Pentagon plans for any number of contingencies, he isn't threatening war. He's normalizing the unthinkable. That single exchange did more than alarm allies. It stripped away the last layer of plausible deniability Republicans had relied on. This wasn't a rogue comment from Trump. This was the machinery of the state quietly acknowledging the option. And once that happened, the debate shifted. Not from whether this was serious, but from how dangerous it could become. And beneath the surface, a deeper mechanism was already at work. What's driving this isn't impulse, it's structure. The modern presidency has accumulated enormous latitude in matters of force. Congress debates, allies react. But the executive branch plans continuously, quietly, and often without constraint. Contingency planning becomes a substitute for consent. Optionality becomes power. Trump understands this instinctively. By refusing to rule anything out, he doesn't have to choose. He shifts the burden onto others, lawmakers, allies, even reality itself, to stop him. And in a system designed to avoid confrontation, that hesitation creates momentum. Republicans, meanwhile, are caught inside that machinery. Many don't support the idea. Most don't want the consequences. But the system rewards delay. It punishes clarity. And so caution takes the form of process, not opposition. That's how norms erode. Not with declarations, but with silence. Not with orders, but with doors left ajar. Greenland exposes this mechanism because it sits at the intersection of everything Republicans claim to value: NATO, deterrence, stability, and credibility. You cannot quietly look away from all four at once. And yet, the system keeps moving. Because when power learns it will not be challenged, it doesn't need to justify itself anymore. And that's when the second shock arrives. The second shock didn't come from the Pentagon. It came from the White House podium. When asked directly whether military force was off the table in Greenland, the answer was no. Not once, not twice. Repeated refusals to close that door. All options are always on the table. A sentence designed to sound strong and land heavy. That was the escalation. Because this time, ambiguity wasn't procedural. It was political. The administration wasn't merely planning. It was signaling to Denmark, to NATO, to Congress, and to Republicans who had hoped this would quietly disappear. Suddenly, this was no longer about internal deliberations. It was about external pressure, about testing how far an ally could be pushed, about whether coercion could be reframed as security. And that changed the calculus. Republican leaders began issuing statements, careful ones. No military action, not appropriate, not an option. The language mattered, because what they were really saying was this: we see the danger, but we don't yet know how to stop it. That hesitation is revealing. In moments of real crisis, speed matters, clarity matters, and delay becomes its own decision. Greenland had become more than a hypothetical. It was now a live question. And the people who would feel it first weren't in Washington. If you're watching this from afar, it's tempting to think none of this touches you. After all, Greenland feels distant, abstract, a map problem. But here's where it becomes personal. Because when leaders blur the line between ally and asset, you inherit the risk, you pay for it in credibility lost, in alliances weakened. In a world that becomes less predictable and more dangerous, not overnight, but gradually. If you're an American, this shapes how your country is seen when it speaks about democracy, sovereignty, and rules. If you live in a NATO country, it raises a quieter fear. If norms bend here, where else do they bend next? And if you're a Republican voter, there's a deeper tension. You may not support this. Most Americans don't. Polls show that clearly. Yet silence in politics is rarely neutral. It has weight, it has consequence. I want you to sit with that discomfort, not because it's pleasant, but because it's clarifying. Moments like this force a question no party can avoid forever. At what point does loyalty turn into permission? And once the world notices that shift, the effects don't stop at one island. What happens next doesn't stay contained, because alliances are ecosystems. Stress one point, and pressure ripples outward. When the United States signals that even a NATO ally's territory is negotiable, every partner recalculates quietly, defensively. For Europe, the implication is destabilizing. NATO's credibility rests on a shared assumption. Borders are not bargaining chips. Once that assumption weakens, deterrence weakens with it. Adversaries don't need speeches. They watch behavior. For rivals, the lesson is simpler. If Washington can frame coercion as security when it suits its interests, others will feel licensed to do the same. Precedent is the most exportable form of power. And for America itself, the cost is subtle but profound. Leadership becomes harder when trust erodes, coordination slows. Doubt creeps in not about capability, but about intent. Greenland, in this sense, is not the center of the story. It's the signal, a test of whether the post-war order still holds, or whether it has entered a phase where rules exist only until they become inconvenient. Once that perception spreads, restoring confidence is far harder than losing it. And that's what makes the future so uncertain. Looking ahead, there are only a few paths this can take, and none are trivial. The first is restraint. Republicans draw a clear line. Congress acts. The military option is formally taken off the table. Alliances absorb the shock, bruised but intact. This is the best-case scenario, not because it's clean, but because it restores a basic truth. Power still answers to limits. The second is drift. No invasion, no formal decision, just continued ambiguity. Statements that reassure without committing. This is the most likely outcome and the most corrosive. Because norms don't collapse all at once. They thin, they fade, and the damage accumulates quietly. The third is escalation. Pressure intensifies, coercion becomes policy, and the unthinkable becomes unavoidable. In that world, the United States isn't just testing alliances, it's redefining itself. Not as a leader bound by rules, but as a power willing to bend them when convenient. History tells us which path systems tend to follow, not the one leaders promise, the one institutions allow. And that brings us to the final question, the one Republicans and Americans can no longer postpone. This is the moment where ambiguity runs out. Republicans can insist this was never serious, that it was misunderstood, that it will pass. But history is unkind to that kind of comfort. Because power doesn't reveal itself in intentions, it reveals itself in what it's allowed to do. Greenland matters not because it will be invaded tomorrow. It matters because it shows how far the boundaries have already moved. What once would have ended a conversation now barely begins one. What once would have triggered resistance now triggers hesitation. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Systems don't fail when people cheer their collapse. They fail when too many people decide it's safer not to look. If you care about alliances, about credibility, about a world where rules restrain force rather than excuse it, then this isn't someone else's dilemma. It's yours. Silence is not neutrality. It's participation. The question is no longer what Donald Trump wants. It's what the institutions around him will permit. If you want to understand where this leads and what comes next when restraint finally breaks, stay with me. Share this. Question it. Because the future isn't shaped by the loudest voices. It's shaped by the moments we choose not to ignore.